Welcome to another Orbit online event. This time is with our friends from Danske Bank. We hope that we would be able to do this event in real life, but because of you know what, we decided to go online. So thank you everyone for showing up, and thank you to Danske Bank who are going to take us through building an Angular app today. This is what we have ahead of us this afternoon. However, the speakers have told me that it's going to be a little more fluid than this, so it's going to be switching back and forth between theory and code along. The speakers recommend that you follow the code along on your screens, and that you look at the code at a later stage, and it will be sent to you after this event. So before we begin, I just have a few quick things to go through. So first of all, I want to make all of you aware that this talk is being recorded, and that we will make it publicly available later on. However, please hang tight, as of course it's more interesting with a live session. So here's a brief presentation of the team present here today. From Danske Bank, we have Frederikke, we have Per, and we have Rasmus, and you'll get to meet them just in a second. You're welcome to post your chats during the code along. However, there's also a Q&A session at the end for more general questions. A very quick advertising spot for some of our upcoming events in Orbit. You can read about them on the site and social channels. And of course, we encourage you to follow us and throw some likes in our direction. So before I hand you over to Frederikke, I can tell you that today's slides will be sent to you via email tomorrow. And for now, that's all for me. I'll leave you in the capable hands of Frederikke. Over to you, Frederikke.
Thank you so much. Then I would like to share my screen just for a minute.
I will just exit mine.
Please say when you can see my screen.
Yep.
It works?
It works.
Well, hi everyone, and thank you so much for joining this workshop in Angular. I just wanted to say welcome as well. My name is Frederikke, and I'm a talent consultant in Danske Bank. And at the moment, I'm working with the internship program, and I'm responsible for recruiting new interns. So I just wanted to make some advertisement as well. And I actually do not want to say so much about the program, but instead I want to show you a video that we have made that tells you a bit about how it's like to be an intern in Danske Bank, and definitely what you can expect. And then, of course, I would recommend you, if you think it sounds interesting, to send an application to internship at danskebank.dk as fast as possible. But let me just share the video with you guys. Oh, sorry, I forgot the sound. Just a second. There you go.
Som praktikant i Danske Bank, der ved jeg hver dag mange nye og spændende teknologier, og så har jeg en masse erfarne udviklere at spare med. Det jeg synes er fedest ved min praktik, altså det er, at mine kodeopgaver rent faktisk giver værdi for Danske Banks kunder og mine kollegaer. Altså, man får opgaver på lige fod med de andre på teamet, og så kan det hurtigt ende med, at man har noget i produktion, som faktisk bliver benyttet af kunder.
Jeg har selv mulighed for at bestemme, hvor jeg gerne vil udvikle mig, både personligt og professionelt, og så praktikken samtidig også bare et godt springbræt for en længere karriere i Danske Bank. Man får et godt netværk blandt de andre praktikanter og studenter medhjælper. Man kan virkelig mærke, at det er et gennemtænkt praktikforløb, hvor der både er fokus på det faglige, men i høj grad også det sociale, og det kan jeg jo kun anbefale til andre.
Yes. So that was actually what I wanted to show you guys, and now I just wanted to enjoy the rest of the workshop. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me also via this email address. Yes. So take it away, Per and Rasmus.
yeah, I think I'll start by sharing my screen. So let me know when you can see it.
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. So this is the first time we're doing it in less than 2 hours, I guess. This is a rework of a 2 days, full days workshop we actually give all the new interns here in Danske Bank. So yeah, we'll try and see if we make it all the way through, and if we'll have time for the Q&A. But I hope we'll we'll get there. So a quick explanation of this Angular session is, well, the goal is to create a kick-ass reactive Angular application. That's maybe a stretch for, well, less than 2 hours, but what we are going to do is create a YouTube search application. We're going to do it using Angular and try and get around and to a lot of Angular concepts, so you'll get to know what Angular is about. And like mentioned before, we are trying to, well, I guess have a split between some slides and explanation of what Angular is and what the concepts are, and then we'll do some coding. And for some reason, Rasmus, he got to do all the fun stuff, and I have to just push the slide button. I don't know. I don't like that, but that's how it is, I guess. So I'll start by explaining what Angular is. Well, Angular is, like I wrote, a single-page client application framework and platform. It's based on TypeScript, which is, of course, based on JavaScript. We actually, in the initial workshop, we also have slides on JavaScript and TypeScript, and we're working with, well, explaining what it is. We have to assume that you already know what this is. If you don't, doesn't matter. Just try to keep up anyways. There might be some stuff that you want to read up on later, but well, that's it. So you often hear people talk about the difference between Angular and React, and a lot of people, they mention that Angular is a framework and React is a library. And I just want to try and explain a bit what that means. Well, a library, no, let's take framework first. That's often opinionated and delivers a full set of tools that has been proven to work together. That's what you'll see with Angular. There's a lot of concepts in Angular that's made to work very well together. And you're supposed to use these specific tools for doing the job. You can, of course, step outside and do other stuff, but, well, you probably don't want to, because these tools are pretty well founded, and, well, it's easy to also have a common understanding of an Angular project, because all Angular projects look a lot similar because they're built with the same tools, whereas React is more a library. A library is often defined, I guess, as a rich toolbox that can be extended, so it's often extendable, and it's meant to work well with third-party libraries. And I guess you can favor one over the other. I tend to actually like both frameworks and libraries, and I love Angular and React, so I'm not trying to play favorites here, but I'm just saying those are kind of the big differences between frameworks and libraries. I also just want to touch quick on some concepts of declarative programming versus imperative. They can be a little hard to explain or understand, but if you kind of listen to the name, I mean, declarative, that's something you declare. So Angular is more in the declarative barrel, I guess, because you declare stuff. You say this div has the color of this variable, or this width is this size, or these components. This component has these components as children, stuff like that. Whereas in a framework like jQuery, you would say for each element, change the background color or something like that. So that's kind of like the big differences. And also put in, for good measure, a static rendering, which are mostly not considered client application frameworks, but ASP.NET is a very good example where you actually request an HTML page. You do some changes and you send a new request to the web server that will render a new page and send it back to you. I know ASP.NET also has some more Ajax or dynamic concepts like update panels and a lot of other controls that seems more dynamic, but those are like in broad terms what the difference is. So I'll hurry on to the next and final slide before we get to do some actual coding. So I wrote the sub goal of this session or slide is to create an Angular application showing a list of videos with hard-coded data. That might not sound very sexy or exciting, but this is, I mean, it's a process, and we try to introduce small concepts along the way, and this is kind of like the minimal viable product we can actually show you. We have 3 sections, I guess, to explain. One of them is the Angular CLI, which is the Angular command line interface, which is a tool that will help you create projects, components, services, configure modules, and configure stuff generally. You can do everything without the Angular CLI, and it is a separate package you have to download. But again, you probably want to download the Angular CLI in the first place, because that will help you download the rest and set it up. So I highly encourage using the CLI, even though you might want to know what's going on behind the scene at some time when you get more familiar with it, because some of the stuff is easier to change manually. But yeah, we'll get to that later. I'm not even sure manual changing in this course, maybe, but we'll see. I also want to explain something really quickly. A project structure in Angular, when you create a new project, as a minimum, you'll get an index, HTML, a main.ts, a style sheet, which is either a CSS file or SCSS file or whatever style sheet preprocessor you might want to use, an app module TS and an app component TS. It will also actually have an app component HTML file. But this is kind of like the minimum. And since browsers won't know TS files, most browsers at least, and also might probably not know CSS preprocessor files like SAS files, Angular is doing a build step to actually compile all these files, this whole project structure, into simple files that all the browsers understand, which is an index HTML, actually the only HTML file in the solution, which is why it's a single page application framework. Some CSS files, some JavaScript files, and some assets typically put in folder or several folders. Assets are typically images, but it can also be data and other stuff, I guess, that can be fetched. Before explaining how this is done or handing it over to Rasmus, I'll just mention a couple of concepts: property binding, structural directives, and I'll get to that in a second, and also highlight the importance of knowing the URL to the official Angular guide, which is located at angular.io. It's a really nice site. It has everything there, and I even cut out a lot of examples from that site in these slides, just to show you how good it is. You'll find everything there, and I guess if you actually took your time to read it from start to beginning, you'll be very much experts. But I don't think it's meant to be read like that. There is a tutorial you should actually do if you want, but yeah, you can look at that later. I just wanted to highlight it. So I'll just touch on those concepts I mentioned: property binding, also interpolation actually, and the structural directives. I also put some event binding here. I'll just go through them real fast. But you probably all know the input DOM element, which is an input element that will accept user input. Typically is the text input element, which will, allow you to enter a username or password, something like that. Well, password has its own type, but it's still an input. The way to actually bind some stuff to the value of the input element, the value is a property of the input element that holds the value in the input element. You use property binding, and property binding is defined by putting those hard square brackets around the property you want to bind to, and then assign it to the variable you want to bind it to. The variable resides in the code file, actually the component file. You should see that later when Rasmus take over. Also, this is only meant for binding to properties. So if an element has a property, which is actually a JavaScript hook in the DOM, you use property binding. If you just want to write some text inside an element, like in the next example with the div, you'll use interpolation, which is done with those double squiggly braces. And finally, event binding. You can also in Angular bind to all the events. So again, an input element actually has a click event that is fired. You can subscribe to. You normally in JavaScript programmatically subscribe to this, but in Angular, you put those normal parentheses around the property, and then you call the method you want to have as a callback. You can also pass in, I haven't shown that in this example, but you can actually pass in the event parameters of that click event. You will probably, I don't know if you'll see that in this example, but it's called $event, so you could pass that in. And finally, I've shown 2 examples of templates that's using structural directives. This is maybe a little more advanced concept, and we'll get into that later. But you have to know it for now, just to make this first MVP work. 2 of the structural directives is ng4 and ngIf. ng4 is a directive that actually accepts a DOM element as a template and iterates or duplicates that element as much times as there are elements in the collection that iterates over. So in this example, the item collection is an array that contains items elements, and this ng4 will actually create one div for each item in the item collection and put the item's name property inside that div element using interpolation. You'll see other examples later where you can use the same method but use property binding. And this last example, ngIf, will actually hide or show this div element based on the value of the show me property. Both show me and item collection resides in the template, no, not the template, the actual component that you can't see right now, but Rasmus will show you soon. Yeah, so I guess that's it. Rasmus, you can take it from here.
Yep, let's go ahead and see some code. So we've prepared a Git repository for you. You can access it. I recommend you do that after the course because I think we'll be moving so fast that you won't have time to install stuff and get up and running. But we'll go through the code and then you can go to this repository and see it for yourself later on. So yeah, it's just yeah, this repository, which has a README file. I've opened this README file here. And I've done these steps already. So basically, I've installed the Angular CLI, and then I've run this ng, that's the Angular CLI, ng new, which creates a new Angular application, and I want to include routing. So Angular includes a router. That's part of why it's a framework and not a library. It has its own router. I called it Angular intro. Then I've gone into this directory and copied some styles. That's just so we don't have to spend time building styles. And then I've run the ng serve, and that's actually what compiles the code. As Per talked about, it will compile all the small assets. We have TypeScript files, we have CSS, we have HTML, and it will compile those into JavaScript that the browser can understand. So once I've done that, I can go to localhost port 4200 as default, and this is just the welcome page that the Angular CLI will show you. But we actually want to be able to show some videos, so I'll get rid of that. The structure of the application, as Per said, it has created a base component for us. Let's just see the index HTML. It actually, as you can see here, here's an HTML tag that you've probably not seen before if you don't know Angular. So Angular can actually teach us new, teach the browser new tricks. So this is the app component. We'll talk about components more in a short while, but just know that that's what's rendered here. So I'll just get rid of all this that Angular has created for me, except this route outlet. So if I do that, you can see now it's empty. So this app component HTML is the template file for the app component. As you can see, the app component is just a class that has a title. So let me just show you real quick the interpolation that Per talked about. So let's create a header here that uses these double curly braces to interpolate, and we can also write something here. Did I actually copy those styles? That's what I mentioned in here in the README, that you should copy these styles just so we get some nicer fonts and stuff. Okay, so this is the interpolation working here. But what we actually want to do is show some videos. So I'll just copy this in. This is a template of what a YouTube video will look like. So you can see here, it's it has a title, it has a thumbnail, and it has a CSS animation that flips it over and shows the description on the back. So it's like kind of like a card that's flipped over. But we want this to, of course, be dynamic. I mean, this is just static HTML. So in order to do that, we want to get some data. I have some just some dummy data here that I'll just copy into my component. So you can see here, this is a property on the class which was available for us to use in the template. And just like the title, we will add our videos. So now they are also available for us to use in the template. So a video has a title, description, thumb, and a link. And as Pierre said, we want to sprinkle a bit of Angular magic on this. So we'll use this ng4 structural directive to iterate over the videos. So we'll do let video of videos, and that will repeat this div as many times as there are videos in the video array. So let's try. We already saw how interpolation works, so let's start with that. Go.title. Title, sorry. And we can see when as soon as I save, it will reload over here. That's also the Angular CLI that helps us with that. You can see the title now actually grabs the data there. So let's continue with the description. We should see the description update. So now they're also different. And we also want the link right now. Nothing happens when actually it just goes to some default. It just goes to YouTube, I think. But we want to actually we want the actual link to work. So for this, we use property binding, since that's the property of the href element. So we want that to be video. And in the same manner we do for the image source, we want that to be video. So when we do that, we have we've now bound the data in here. We have an array with 2 videos. We are using ng4 to iterate over those videos, and within this div, each video is in scope there. We then bind the properties. We bind the link and the thumb properties to href and source, and we interpolate the title and the description. So that's the very minimum viable product, I would say. It's fun, but not very useful yet. So let's go back to Pierre and see some more concepts that will help us make it more advanced.
Yeah. So the next subcode is to split this application into several components. But first, what are components? Components are stuff that controls a patch of the screen. They are self-contained, reusable, they belong to a module, and they have metadata. That doesn't tell you a lot, but we'll get to that in a moment. They also have a life cycle. So, well, you actually saw a component, because the one Rasmus was working in was a component, just like he showed. App root actually loads the app component that he was working in. So all components do life cycles. They get created and they get destroyed. I highlighted 2 of those, ng on init and ng on destroy. Those are the 2 most used, not the only ones, obviously, but you'll get to use the ng on init in almost all your components. Ng on destroy on lots of them. Also, sometimes I guess the ng after content init and after view init. The rest of them are seldomly used. But of course, the reason I put the asterisk there is because they actually run several times. They're not just run once. Those without the asterisk only run once each lifetime of a component. So, like I mentioned, we're going to split this app component. Rasmus just coded into several subcomponents. And we are doing that because we'll be able to reuse those components. Actually, this example is not taking much advantage of reusing, but again, this is a tour of how you code, I guess, and I'll teach you the concepts. But it does help you with some of the solid principles like single responsibility principle, because you'll actually split the responsibility into the components where I guess it makes sense to put this stuff. It'll also be a little bit easier to actually leverage these structural directives like ng4, or at least easier to actually see what you're doing. One of the very commonly misconception when doing Angular and using the ng4 structural directive is that it does actually repeat the element you put the directive on and not the children. If you've been coding Razor templates in ASP.NET, you'll actually make a kind of a for loop, and then whatever is in the loop is getting repeated. But this is a structural directive, which is actually a syntactical sugar for a template, and that template gets duplicated. Just keep that in mind. I'm just mentioning it because I know a lot of people actually mess this up. Actually, I forgot to mention, actually I'll go back to my first point about components. They belong to a module, and I just wanted to explain that this example we're doing only has one module. Actually, it has two, but it has a root module or an app module, what you call, but it also has a module for the routing. We can look at, we don't have to think about that right now, but if you create a big application, you might want to load it in, create it in different modules. Those modules can be lazy loaded, but they're also very nice abstraction way, because you know that each module won't have access to the module's components and services unless you actually expose those. But the reason why I'm saying this is because when you create this component, you'll use a metadata attribute. You'll see it, I guess Rasmus will show it in a while, and that component will belong to a module. I just want to mention that. But these attributes, you'll see those used a lot, and that's because Angular has embraced TypeScript. So you actually get to use a lot of neat TypeScript features when doing Angular. In the beginning, Angular also supported JavaScript, but I think they dropped that support entirely right now, and there's no documentation on it anymore. So I'll just say I love JavaScript, and TypeScript is just cooler. I mean, it's kind of like if you like ice cream and you sprinkle it with your favorite topping. I mean, it just gets better. So there's nothing not to like. Oh yeah, actually I forgot. I'll show you a small example of a component. You see the add component attribute. It actually tells, it decorates the class hero child component with some metadata, and has a couple of properties. The selector actually shows what the name of this component will be. So like Rasmus showed before, the app root was actually the name of the app module component, the app component. Yeah.
Yep.
This component is called hero child component, and if you want to use that in a template on another component, you will actually create a DOM element called app-hero-child. So that's how it understands it. Also, it has a template property. For this example, template property is nice, but you usually use something called a template URL. So instead of putting the template directly into the JavaScript file, you put it in a external HTML file. You don't have to worry about that because it'll all get compiled into JavaScript once you run the compiler. It's just a matter of what you like. I mean, some people actually like to have the code here, but I kind of like to split it out. But that's a personal preference, I guess. I just want to highlight one thing. You see an input property. We'll get to use that in a little while, but this is actually a way for Angular to tell other users of this component that they can actually pass in a property called hero to this component. And that's done with the property binding you also saw earlier. So you can actually reference this hero. I'll show you first how you reference it in the template. It's called hero, as you can see, and that hero is an object called hero that has a name property. So you can actually write out the name in the template. It has another input parameter, which has a local name of master name, which is also interpolated in the template. I'll show how to use this hero child component. As you can see here, the app hero child is the DOM element that references this component, and you can see the structural directive ng4 actually looping over this hero child for each hero in the heroes collection. And you can see the hero passed into Yeah, okay, I'll show you here. Like I said, the selector, but you can see the hero from the heroes collection is passed into the hero property. It might be a little confusing because it says hero both times, but the hero as the property binding I put in yellow is also referencing the hero property of the input parameter in the component child, whereas the other hero is a local variable for this scope that you can pass in as the value for the hero property. I don't know if that made any sense, but yeah, as you can see, the master property has actually been renamed, which is discouraged. And when you use the default Angular setup, you will actually have TS-lint, which I don't think we'll go into in detail, but that's something that will help you write better code, I guess. And you'll have to actually make an exception to, to be allowed to actually rename this property. But here you can see, yeah, how you can do it. I guess that's it. Rasmus, if you want to show some code.
Yep. Yes, let's build on what Per just said. So right now we have everything jumbled together in our app component, and usually that's not the best idea, since we probably want to separate things out so they have their own separate responsibility. So let's get started creating some components. We'll use the Angular CLI for that. So I'll say ng for generate and component. And I'm thinking of splitting this up into two components actually. One that holds the video list, which is responsible for getting data, searching later on. And then one called video, which only has a responsibility of knowing how to represent a single video and nothing else. So let's do the video list. So when I run this generator, it will create a folder for my new component, and it will actually create 4 files for my component. It will create a TypeScript file, which holds the component. We can see it here, a TypeScript file that holds the component, and a template for the HTML, and a CSS file for the styling. And then we'll also create a test file, actually. We'll hopefully get to that later, the tests. But let me just real quick create the video component as well. So we have the 2 components I was talking about. And let's move some code around. So I no longer want this to be in here. I mean, this mostly has to do with how a single video is presented, plus a bit of iteration. So let's move most of this into the video component. So I want it to look like this. This is what a single video looks like. So you can see this complains now that it doesn't know what does video mean. So to fix that, let's introduce a input field or input property. So we'll say this component has an input property of type video. So that means that users of this app video component can now supply it with a video that it needs to render. You can see that the template is now happy. The video list component, that should actually render video components, and it should do that for each video in videos. Need to move. It shouldn't be in the app component anymore. So I'll move them from here and into the video list component. So now the video list component has the responsibility of providing the data or getting the data and iterating it and supplying it to the video component. That's what I'm doing here. As you can see now, I tried to call it just V, so we can see the distinction here. So video, that's the input property of the video component, and V is the local name in each iteration of the loop. Yeah. So you can see now the component, the output doesn't show anything. That's because this is broken right now. And if I save now, we can see it still doesn't show anything. And that's because right now we're not really showing anything. So we want to actually render our video list. So once we do that, we get the same output as we had before. So this little exercise was a refactoring exercise where we took the logic that we had in app component and split it into 2 components. One component that's responsible for getting the data and iterating it, and then supplying a single video to each of these app video components. and the video component, which was responsible for accepting a video object and then rendering one of these cards for each of those. So now we have a nicer responsibility segregation. So yep. Yeah, over to you, Per. Let's hear some more concepts.
Yeah. So now this next sub goal is to introduce dependency injection and move the data fetching functionality into a service. So Angular has its own dependency injection framework, which works only by constructor injection. Some of you might know other dependency injection frameworks that also makes it possible to inject stuff via properties and stuff. That's a personal preference, I guess. Angular just made a decision to only support constructor injection. That gives them a lot of flexibility and easy ways to handle stuff, I guess. When you configure your container, I don't know if you know about dependency injection, but you typically have a container where you have all your definitions of your instances of your classes, interfaces, actually TypeScript. I guess I don't have to explain that. So you have different ways of configuring your services in the dependency injection container. You can actually use specific instances. You can use just a class, and you can also configure those through a factory method. Sometimes you might not know the information you need for creating a service at runtime, so you can use a factory method. This course again only has one module, actually one code module, but again, the dependency injection can be injected at different levels in the hierarchy if you use several modules. There's an easy way of just automatically configure a service in the container, and that is by using a provide in property of the injectable attribute. I'll show that in a second, but you can also use the tedious, or I don't know if it's tedious, a slower way of actually explaining what you want to import and how you want to import it, which is very useful if you want to do testing later and want to swap those implementations with other implementations. I have an example of a very boring service. It doesn't do anything, but I guess this is like the minimum setup of a service. It's just a class again. It has a constructor. You can have more, of course, but that's the minimum. And it is also decorated with the injectable attribute. And that tells Angular that, hey, this service is going to be injectable at some point. If you don't provide the provide in property, you have to actually put it in the import property of the module declaration, but we don't want to look at that because we don't have to. This is an easy, quick fix because you'll just provide it in the root. There are also two other options to provide it as any, which can be used for lazy loading and also think application level, which might even which can be configured differently. But this is the easy setup. If you want to use this service in a component, which is what we're going to do soon, you'll actually just in the constructor name, give a name of a variable. Again, if you are used to C#, you'll probably be used to seeing the declaration of the type reverse order, but here you actually, no, I don't know if you have to do that in the constructor actually, that doesn't matter. But here you'll give it a name, and then by just telling it what class you want to use, the dependency injection framework will inject this service into this component. By default, it will inject the same instance of this service in all components asking for this service. Yeah, but I guess that's all I have to say. I guess we want to look at some code, Rasmus.
Yeah, all right. So we actually want to do another refactoring exercise. So right now the video list component is responsible for procuring data, and we don't want it to do that. We actually want it to use a service because later on we of course want to have some dynamic data. So let's generate a service, and since we're getting data from YouTube later on, we'll call it YouTube. So I'll call ng G service YouTube. That will generate a service for me. So while we wait for that, I'll just grab this data here. I'll just say that, just declare that this this still has a local property of type video array. The video is just this the title, description, thumb, and link. Yeah. So it has now generated this YouTube service for me, and as you can see, it has the injectable annotation that Pierre talked about, and nothing else. But we want to have a search function, so we can actually search for videos. And for now, it will just return our dummy data. It'll just return our array here. So as you can see, the application is now broken, obviously, because well, we're not doing anything anymore. We're not providing videos. It's just an undefined property. So what we want to do now is in this ng-on-init, which we learned is one of the lifecycle hooks that Angular has. We actually want to get the data at this stage. But before we do that, we need to get a hold of the YouTube service so we can actually get the data. So let me inject that. So call it whatever. What matters for the injection framework is actually the type here. So when Angular sees this, it says, oh, I know this. This is an injectable. And then it will check and see if it's already instantiated and provide that instance. If it's not, it will new it up and then provide it. So now we have access to it here, and we can search. And then I can assign the result to this.videos. Give us the same result as we had before. Yeah, so in essence, it's the dependency framework is actually quite simple to use. If you have something that's decorated with this injectable, and a lot of built-in Angular services are already services, then you can just inject them in the constructor and get access to them, and that's very powerful both for production code, but also for when we come to testing, because then we can easily mock what's injected here. Yeah, cool. So our application is now even prettier. It has better separation of responsibilities. Yeah, back to you, Per.
Yeah, I just want to mention again that this is a really, really fast introduction to Angular, and we are going to build a whole application in less than 2 hours. So if you don't get what we're saying, don't, despair, because, if you understood this, well, hell, that's pretty impressive. I hope you'll get an understanding of what's possible, and maybe you'll be able afterwards to look at the examples and replicate this yourself. But, don't get mad at yourself if you can't follow, because, yeah, we are covering a lot of stuff in a very short amount of time. So the next slide is pipes. This might seem a little bit detached to what we're doing, but it's a concept we really want to introduce because we are going to use a built-in pipe later, and also it's a really nice concept to know about. But our goal for this next topic is creating or demonstrating how to do some simple formatting in the template using a pipe. So Angular pipes, I wrote, is a way to display write display value chainable transformations that you can declare in your HTML. That doesn't tell you a lot, I guess, but what I'm trying to say is that you can actually chain these pipes, so you have some data and you can pass them through a function to modify them or even filter them, and then you'll get a result in the end. Those are really nice for doing stuff like the two built-in pipes. One example is a date pipe that actually takes a date object. Since the only way to actually write a date in the template would be to call to string, and that doesn't really display really well. You can actually pipe this date object into a function that will format it nicely for you. Another example, I actually show the date pipe in a while. Another example is the uppercase pipe, which will, well, uppercase, I guess the first letter of a sentence. I'm not really sure. I haven't really used it. I guess that's what it does. But also that's pretty simple or self-explanatory, I guess. It'll take in a string and it'll uppercase the first letter of that string, or maybe even the whole string. I don't know, Rasmus, can you help me out? Which one is it?
I actually think it uppercases everything, but I'm not sure either.
Yeah, maybe it does.
I guess it's something you mostly use for demos. It's not terribly useful. So.
Yeah, no, it's not very useful, but I guess it's a nice thing to explain. So the concepts we want to go through are custom pipes. That's where it gets really exciting, right? Because you can do your own pipes. You don't have to use the built-in pipes. And once you created a pipe, you can reuse that again all over your application. I think we'll actually do a pipe we can reuse more than once. You can also use the pipes, like I said, as a map or filter, actually, obviously, because you can transform stuff with it and you can filter stuff with it. You can also use it in NG4, which for some might seem dirty, but I guess it isn't, because a pipe is actually just a function that takes in some parameters and returns something else. I just want to mention one thing. Pipes can be actually pure or impure. That doesn't say a lot without some context. That's because Angular is doing something differently than React. It's actually doing change detection. It's trying to detect whenever there's been changes. In React, you actually have to either change something that is some properties that is part of a state, or actually do something to monitoring these changes. But in Angular, it does its own change detection. So if the input parameter of a pipe changes, it will render something out. But sometimes you might have a pipe, let's say a timer or clock pipe that doesn't really take new input. It just display the time. It has to be impure because it handles stuff internally. Yeah, I'll just show you an example. This is actually a component using a pipe. So this is not how you make a pipe. This is just how you use it in a component. I've taken this directly from Angular website. So the class itself, or the component itself, has a property called number. No, sorry, it's called today, which is actually number. I don't know, why that is. Oh, yeah, okay. That's because you can actually cast it to one, I guess. But it takes out the current date, which is a number. That's true. Sorry, my mistake. And in the template, you can actually see the pipe symbol after today. I'll just quickly show here. So this pipe is actually telling the template that we want to pipe this property through this pipe called date. And this example will just pipe the today property into the date pipe. This one will actually also supply a parameter called full date, and this one another parameter that, as you might be able to recognize, this looks like a date format string. I'll just show examples. What the output will be if you have a date object and you pipe it through the date pipe, you will get this. And if you give it a medium what you call parameter, it will know to format it this way, and so forth. This is like a standard date format string, I guess you can also pass in. So these are just some examples of pipes, but I think it's more exciting to actually see one being written. So it's you again, Rasmus.
Yeah. All right. And for this example purpose, I think we'll just create a very simple pipe. So I'll again use the Angular CLI to create that, and we'll create an emphasize pipe that will just be able to emphasize some keyword in some text. Yeah. And while that's loading or creating, there we go, the emphasize pipe. So as you can see here, it's just a class again, but that's annotated with this pipe decorator and with a name. So, and the name is what we can use in the template, just like we saw in the pairs example with date. And it takes a value and some arguments. In our case, we know the type of these. So let's say we want to pass in a string, and we want to pass in a keyword. Keyword. That's probably one word, and that's also a string. And we want to return a string. And I'll just do something very simple. We could get creative with regular expressions if we wanted to, but let's just say we want to replace the keyword with something that makes it stand out a bit more. So I'll do this keyword, then 3 stars, something like that. So now if you supply a keyword, we can also, I'll just show you that you can have default parameters. So if you don't supply anything, let's say we want it to be Angular. So if we go into the video component and the title here, we wanna emphasize Angular here. So if we do that, we can see over here that Angular now gets emphasized by being put into these 3 stars. And as Pierre mentioned, this is totally reusable, so we can use it everywhere, of course. So we can also do it in the description. So you can see it's also working there. And let's say in the description here, we instead want to emphasize React. We can do that by adding a property, so colon, and then the parameter to this pipe. So you can see in the description now it's React that's being emphasized. Yeah, so that was a quick run through of what pipes are. So to recap, it's basically just a pure function that takes some input and gives some output. In our case, it was strings, but it could be other things. It doesn't have to be strings. It could be objects that it's working on. But in this simple example, it's just a string. So it's a nice concept that you can use for a lot of stuff actually. But yeah, don't overuse it. It can come with a performance penalty if you overuse it. Yeah, but I think it's time we get to some more interesting stuff. Back to you, Ben.
Yeah. So
I know Pierre's getting excited now.
Yeah. So I think there's something wrong with my setup right now. Hold on a second.
So because you have the pointer on?
Yeah, I think so, but I can't really. Oh, okay, still works. So yeah, this is. I know I asked said that because this is maybe my favorite topic, and I'm really afraid that I'm gonna upset some people because again, like I said, we have very limited amount of time. I have no expectation that somebody without any prior knowledge will come out of this and then know everything about Angular. But we are actually almost going through everything in Angular, so you will at least get an overview of what's possible, and you will have the possibility to play with this yourself afterwards. So stay with us and enjoy whatever you can from this. But observables. Okay, let me start from the beginning. Our sub goal now is to actually fetch some real data. That's exciting in itself, I guess, because until now we've just been using static data. So we're going to use actually YouTube API, call it with the HTTP and get some response back. The way Angular is doing this is through a service called HTTP client. I mean, that's at least the recommended way. And the HTTP client is really nice because it actually returns observables. So what are observables? And I know we could spend 2 days talking about it. No, we could spend 2 weeks, I guess, talking about what observables is and what they can be. It's a really big concept, but it's also very pure, and it's a pretty, I mean, once you get it, once it clicks, I mean, you won't be able to sleep for a week, I guess, because you will be dreaming about it every night. And even, no, okay, I'll stop now but anyways, it's pretty hard to explain what it actually is, but I'm trying to, and I've looked up on the net how other people is trying to explain it. And I heard phrases like, it's programming with asynchronous data streams. Actually, if you've been coding Java of the recent versions, you might have come across the concept of streams, and it's exactly that. It's just like streams in Java. But it can also be looked at as Lodash for events. Lodash you might know that. That's a JavaScript framework that does manipulations on arrays. It's also link.net on steroids, because if you know link.net, you know how to chain data on iterables, and you can manipulate that to your will. But the reason why I'm saying on steroids or for events is because observables are asynchronous by nature. Those are not predefined arrays or data collection. Those are streams with data coming asynchronously over time. And that's the key point here. Observables are really, really nice if you work with stuff that is asynchronously. And I put here for good measure that everything is observables, and I just want to, show this little guy because he's almost as excited as I am about this concept. So Angular embraced this concept, and it's a really hard concept. I know some people are trying to get around it and do stuff, do a lot of stuff to avoid using observables. But I plead you, if you want to become good at Angular, you have to learn this sooner or later. It will really make you a master once you catch on, and it will take some time and maybe several iterations before you get it, but it's really cool if you don't already know. So the framework, there are several frameworks. I mean, observables is just a concept, but there's a really big framework out there called ReactiveX. And their main implementation of this framework is called RxJS, which is a JavaScript implementation of ReactiveX. Obviously, there are TypeScript types for it, which means that you will get full type completion and type checking and stuff for that. That's really nice. The way it works is you can think of it as plumbing or piping. I know that's one way Rasmus likes to explain it, that you have some data and you funnel it through pipes. And those pipes, you can put like small intersections into them where you put functions. Those functions can either modify or filter or do even crazier stuff. We'll get to that later. But for now, let's just focus on modify and filtering this data. So if you recognize this from link.net, you probably remember the select and the where clause. This is kind of like that for JavaScript filter and map, which is also already, methods on arrays. But those can be used for observables as well. I just want to mention that I might not make a lot of sense right now, but it will later. So I want to mention that observables can be either infinite or finite. Infinite observables are observables that never end. Think of it like, again, some water flowing through a pipe. It will always be there, right? But and finite observable is more like if you request some data and you get it, you won't get more. You'll only get one set. So again, maybe a better explanation of an infinite observable is you're looking for user input. It could be a mouse move event, or it could be just typing on the keyboard. You never know when the user is finished. So these pipes are something you define. So you actually define the data you get in a stream, how you modify it. Once you have this definition, if you want to actually listen to it, you have to subscribe to it. If you don't subscribe to an observable, nothing will actually happen. You'll just have a description of it, but it won't do anything with it. So you have to subscribe to the data. And I put unsubscribe there. We can ignore that for now, but it'll get important later because it is a resource. It can be a resource that needs to be disposed of, and the unsubscribe would actually dispose this resource. If you forget to do that and have a design that actually subscribes a lot of times, you will actually end up with memory leaks and can see that in the browser. But it's not really a problem because once you use it, you also get used to unsubscribing again. Again, I mentioned the HTTP client, which is a service Angular provides. It's part of the HTTP client module, which is supplied, of course, by Angular, and Rasmus will show how to use that. It has some asynchronous methods like get and post, which you recognize from HTTP requests, I guess. It also has JSONP and put and other methods that you can play around with. This client, all these methods, most of them, I guess, will return an observable, and those observables can be piped, subscribed, etc. I know for this case, we're subscribing to something where we are actually only require or expect one result. So we're actually getting what's called a finite observable, which also means you don't have to unsubscribe it. That's why it's not going to unsubscribe in this first video, but I'm just telling you now because maybe you'll remember for later. And like I said, the observable can be piped. We're going to use that in a later episode, I guess. So, I'll show you actually, because it can be a little hard to understand what these pipes are. The first line with the 1, 2, 3 on it, if you think of this as a timeline, so you get like different, it could be user inputs. The user's typing something. He's typing a 1 and he's typing a 2 and he's typing a 3. This might look different once we get to the user inputs, but we'll more about that later. Let's say we actually want to multiply these results by 10. We pipe those through and a function, a pure function called map, which will just take the input of 1, 2, and 3 multiplied by 10 and return return the values 10, 20, and 30. So that's a definition of an observable. There's another example here where you actually have some values you want to filter out. So let's say you want to filter out only values greater than 10. You will add a filter property. These functions are chained in this pipe method. You'll see that later. But again, this is just an example. Also, when you see these pipes, you can go to RxJ Marbles, I think it's called, and you will see this way of explaining all these operators. There's lots of operators, different ones that can do different stuff. You'll see this pipe here that actually means that the stream has ended. Doesn't mean much for this example, but it's nice to know. So I guess it's you again, Rasmus.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. All right, so as Pierre said, the goal of this next little exercise is to actually get some data from YouTube API. So in order to do that, we need to import the HTTP client module, and that's a Angular module. So let me import that from HTTP. So this is the app module file. We talked a bit about modules. You haven't seen it before, so yeah, don't worry too much about it. But in order to be able to use that module, we need to import it and specify to Angular that we're actually importing that module. So now I've done that, and we should be able to use it in our YouTube service. So instead of this dummy data, we actually want to be able to search. So we want to do inject the HTTP client, and we use Angular's dependency injection, of course. And now this HTTP service is available here. So we want to call get, and we have a base URL somewhere that's in here. I'll just copy it in here, then we can see it. So we have a base URL here that's just the URL to the that's just how you search in YouTube. So basically you give it a query at the end, and there's an API key that I've created. So if you want to play with this, you need to set up your own YouTube API key, but we have instructions on how to do that as well. So let me create I'll just create a query here that defaults to, I don't know, cats. So I know that the format that YouTube results, that YouTube returns has a specific format, and I've created an interface for that I've called YouTube result. Let's just take a quick look. So YouTube result is an object that has an items array, which looks like this. So it's a bit nested structure, and as so far we've seen, we've used this flat structure. We only use these 4 properties. So we want to map this nested structure to be this flat structure. So that's the next thing I want to do. So let's just see. Let me just assign this property for a second, and then we can see what the observable is. Oh, sorry, what the type is. And you can see here that it's an observable of YouTube results. So we are able to pipe that and use the map operator since we want to transform the result. I need to import the map. Using it Angular doesn't, Visual Code doesn't really help me. But once we've done it once, then we will get help. So I'm importing map here. And I have a result here, and I want to return the items and map those again. So this might be a bit confusing. We have 2 different maps in play here. So this map is the observable operator that grabs the result. Whenever something comes through the pipe, it will grab that and then run this function. And this map is the map function on an array. So basically, we want for each item in here, we want to map that to a video result. So let's just create a function here. It's called video that accepts a YouTube video. So that will have this nested format that I showed you before, and it should return a flat video. So we wanted to have a title. That's video.snippet.title. So that's again, this nested structure. Description can be found in the same place, video snippet description. The thumbnail can be found in video thumbnails, medium URL. So that's the link to the image. And the actual link to YouTube, we need to piece that together a bit. So a YouTube link looks like this, right? And the stuff at the end is what actually identifies the video. So instead of that hard-coded thing, we want to append video ID. Okay. So now our search function, let's just return this instead. So now our search function actually returns an observable of video arrays. So that's basically broken our application, because now we are returning some asynchronous data. So instead of, so we can't, let's just see what it's telling us here. So it's telling us that I'm expecting a type of video array, but I'm getting observable of video array. So we actually call search, but nothing's happening, and I can show that. Let me just open the network tab here. Let me just pop it in. Okay. So no requests are going out until I actually subscribe to this. So once I subscribe and once data actually arrives from YouTube, which is asynchronous, I want to assign that to our local variable again. All right, so now we're actually getting some funny cat videos from YouTube, because that's what I added as the search query. Let's just convince ourselves that it works by replacing this with dogs. You can see dog videos. Cool. So now we have something that actually fetches data from YouTube API, but it's still not a search engine, I guess, since you have to change the code to be able to tell it what you want to search for. So to recap real quick, we are calling the HTTP client get, which returns an observable, and we map that to our own flat structure here. And then instead of just assigning the result directly, we subscribe to it, and then in the callback here, we assign the videos that we get here. You can see that's of type video array. Yeah, so now we have something that's actually dynamic data. All right, but let's go back and see what else we can do.
Yeah, so this next slide, this is going to be the hardest of all, I guess. And once you master this, I mean, you're Angular master. So again, don't expect this to happen just by watching this video alone. But yeah, so our sub goal now is to actually work with real user input, like Rasmus said. So instead of just hard coding dogs or cat, we want to add some user input where the user can actually type whatever he or she wants to search for. But we also want to learn how to handle stream of streams. That sounds complicated, and I guess that's complicated as it gets, I guess. So yeah, I put a little funny graph I found on the net and modified. So the learning curve of observables is pretty steep, but once you get it, I mean, it's all chugging away from there. I mean, you'll feel really nice once you get there. So keep at it. I promise you, it'll be the best investment return of investment you ever put in. So again, what we are going to work with reactive forms. So Angular has two different form modules or form, I guess frameworks or whatever to play with. One of them is templated forms. I'm not going to go into details what that is, but the other one is reactive forms. And the reason why we pick reactive forms, besides being the best forms framework, is because they work with observables, and the strength of observables is getting multiplied with the use of observables. So, I mean, if you only have one observable, it might not seem really nice, but once you get data from different sources and they're all observables, you'll start to get some real value from the setup, and Rasmus will show that in a little while. So Again, I won't go into too much detail because we want to get to some code, but these reactive form elements will actually have a property instead of just value, which you saw on a normal DOM element. You'll also have a value changes, which is actually an observable you can chain and subscribe and do all stuff with. Just want to touch again on the observable operators. We looked at filter and map. There's also merge, so you can actually have several observables and merge those into one. There's stuff like debounce time. Rasmus is going to show that how to limit the user's input. So instead of getting some data on the stream each time the user types, we only want to get it when he pauses for maybe half a second or 200 milliseconds or something like that. And there are also different lots of operators like tab where you can actually do. Normally these operators are pure. They don't, and also they are, what's the word I'm looking for, Rasmus? Yeah, it doesn't matter. But tab actually, tab can act, they are without side effects, but tab actually is a way to put side effects into an observable stream. So you can actually, I mean, you're not encouraged to do actual side effects that modified stuff, but you can do stuff like logging or typing into the console. So it's really good for debugging purposes. And what we're going to learn now, and what this slide is all about, is handling observables, which is also streams of streams. I'm just going to show you this drawing here. If you look at the top blue line, imagine some observable that will, trigger each day. You'll get like a date each day. But what you really want is to get some weather data each day. So each time you get a date on this observable, I mean, it's kind of a weird example because you probably won't leave it for a day, but let's not dwell on that. Each time you get a new date, you want to request some data, some weather data. And that's denoted by this dotted line. I'll try and put on this laser pen again. So this is also a timed line. This line shows time going by, but this also shows time going by. But this is a new observable. And so you can actually see that each request makes a new, each day you get a new request, but what you want to end up with is just a new stream that only holds the data, because that's all you care about. And you might ask, why is the green one not here? Because switch map is a special kind of map. There are different maps. There's exhaust map, switch map, concat map, merge map, and also flat map, which is actually all these maps, different maps are just aliases for flat map. Flat map is a map operator that flattens a nested structure, and it can take a lot of different parameters. And this switch map has a special feature that actually says, I'm only interested in the data from the latest parent event. So you can see once you actually get the new date and you haven't gotten any data from the previous date, it will cancel the request. And Angular's HTTP client service is actually so nice that it actually understands that it will have to cancel the HTTP request as well. So even though the observable only cancels this, the client also understands and cancels the HTTP request. So you don't want to get data for this 19th of July when you are when you just got a request for the 18th, because you obviously want to see from the 18th. So again, this could be like a user selecting something in a calendar control or something like that. So you only want to see the most recent data. So I just want to mention the async pipe because we're going to use that. The async pipe is a pipe you can actually use on observables in the template. It handles subscription and unsubscription of streams. That's really nice. We'll get to that, or hopefully later. It can work on observables and promises, but it also works on null and undefined, which is something that a lot of stuff doesn't work well with. Because you obviously can't ask for a property on a null or undefined object. But this async pipe actually understands this. I'll hurry over to Rasmus so we can see some code.
All right. So let's start out with this, with changing our code to using the async pipe, because then we don't need to worry about subscribing and unsubscribing. So instead of this videos being a video array, we actually want to change it. So I'm changing the name as well, and that's just a convention that's very much used, that when you have observables, you end with a $sign. So instead of this being a video array, I want it to be an observable of video array. And then I can just assign that directly here. So instead of subscribing all that, I'll just do this. And then, so now we're just getting the observable, and as you can see in the network tab, nothing's happening because no one's subscribing. So even though I'm calling search, which is calling get, there's actually no get request being sent out. And that's because no one's. But if we deploy the async pipe, all that changes, and we see that it actually, once the component loads, it will actually subscribe to this observable and and use the results of that in this ng4 expression. And once the component is destroyed, it will unsubscribe again. So that's a nice feature. All right, but we wanted to have some user input, and to do that, we need to import the reactive forms module. So let me just do that. And that's also an Angular module, which is located in forms. And it's called reactive. And I'll just add it down here as well. Now we have access to form controls, which is something you can bind to a form element. So let's create a form element in our video list. So I'm creating a, let me just create a div with that. Let's type search, and let's give it a placeholder. Search YouTube. Let's just see how that works. Yeah, so now we have a field here that says search YouTube, but of course nothing happened so far. So in order to hook this input field up to our backend or our code, we're creating a form control, and I'm creating a form control called query. Sorry, new form control. I'll new that up. And form control takes the initial value, and I'll just set that to empty for now. So now we actually have a form control, and in order to hook that up, we will use, again, Angular's property binding. Control equals query. Yep, like that. All right, so now it's sort of hooked up, but no one's listening to it. So let's fix that. Let's create a new observable called user search, which will emit values whenever the user searches. And we can create that from the value changes. So let's just hover over that, and we can see that this is an observable. It's an observable of any. Unfortunately, Angular doesn't have strongly typed form controls yet. So it doesn't know. I mean, it could be a number, it could be a Boolean, but we know it's a string. But anyway, let's just try that for now. And then, so let me just, I'll just subscribe to this so we can see what actually happens. And then we can console log. And let me just show the console. So you can see that every time I type, it emits the entire value of the input field. It doesn't emit each character, but it emits the entire value. So I can do stuff like this. All right, so now we know what the user search is. It's something that emits the keyword that the user searches for every time it changes. So let's try and incorporate that into our search. So instead of just being YouTube service search, we will actually use the user search and then pipe. And then we need to map this user search. But as Per showed, well, actually, I'll show you what happens if we do that. Map operator, and the user search will use that to actually call the search. Like so. But you can see it's complaining now because this is actually it's saying type observable of video array is not assignable, and that's what Per was talking about. We now have a stream of streams, and that's not what we want. So instead of map, we'll use the switch map operator that Per showed us. So now it should be actually working. So let's search for cats. everything else. But if we check the network tab, you can see that I'm shooting a lot of network requests against YouTube. Most of them are being cancelled in flight, and that's actually the switch map operator at work. But maybe I don't want to actually search each time I press a key. That might be, I'll probably use my quota on YouTube fairly fast. So I want to debounce this search. And debounce is where you actually wait for the user to stop typing for a little while. So you can imagine in a imperative environment, you would have to set up some timers, and you'd have to keep track of some state of when the user last typed and when he stopped. And then the timer will fire, and then you can actually trigger an action or something. But with observables, it's actually extremely simple. I can just pipe this observable through a debounce time, let's say 400 milliseconds. And that's it. Now I can just type, and once I stop typing, it will search. So I can see my network tab here isn't flooded with requests, even though I'm typing a lot. So in basically one line of code, we've done something that would be actually fairly complicated to achieve with other types of frameworks. Let's say we also want to limit, we don't want to search for just one letter. So let's try and use the filter operator. So we want the query to query length, or we only want to allow query length larger than 2, for instance. So now if nothing happens, you can see that there's nothing in there. We'll search for dog. Cool. So now we actually have, I think, the base of what we promised to reach here. We actually have a reactive application that searches YouTube and also has some nifty features to make sure we don't flood the YouTube API. But hopefully we'll have time for a bit more, but let's see. To recap what I did, I created a input field where I added I hooked it up to a form control, and the form control is defined in my component class here. It's just a form control with an empty initial value. And then I listen to its value changes property, which is an observable that will stream out changes whenever that happens. And then I do a bit of augmentation to that stream. I put debounce time to ensure that I don't get flooded, and I put filter to ensure that I don't get just two-letter searches. Yeah. And then I combine the user search with the YouTube search, so and flattening the result in route, so I don't get this observable of observables. Yeah, I think that was it for this. Back to you.
Yeah, I think we can at least do one more, but I was thinking maybe I don't know if people can indicate if they want us to continue, if they want the Q&A session, because the Q&A session will cut out some of the stuff, I guess. We won't make it all the way through, but depends on what people want. Yeah. Anyways, I'll just continue for now, and we'll see.
Yeah, it doesn't look like there's too many questions at the moment, so
No.
I'll keep an eye on the chat.
Okay, cool. So okay, now we're going to look at routing. So this next subgoal is to learn about routing and store user input in the URL, and also how to deep link. And these are concepts that are very important, I guess, for all the all web applications, I guess, being able to deep link into stuff. But also, no matter what kind of application you make, you probably end up needing to store some data, and there are lots of ways of storing data. But a really nice way to store it, I think, is using the URL, at least if it's simple data. And this example is really simple. We actually just want to store the search query in the URL, which is very, it's a very simple task, at least in concept. And also, a really nice thing about this is that this whole routing concept in Angular is also working with observables, so we can actually get the route as observables. Let me just explain what routing is. Like I said in the beginning, we have actually 2 modules, even though I keep saying we have 1 because we have the app module, but we also have a routing module. That's because you can separate the concerns of the routing in its own module. That's clever, but you can also attach modules to different sub modules again if you want to do lazy loading, or you just want to, divide and conquer your application so it's easier to maintain, I guess. So there are different reasons why you want several modules, but as a minimum, when you add the routing in the CLI, you get its own module. As again, you can configure it with the CLI, but what it actually is, it's just a list of route objects. And a route object has some properties. The most important ones, I guess, is the path, because that's the path that is trying to match to whatever is in the URL. And if it can match that path, it will load a specific component. You can also, I put in the description, you can also do redirects. You can actually nest these paths. You can have it load different components in different outlets, and you can do authorization against this. So some users can only activate some routes and stuff like that. There's a lot of cool features in this routing. Like I mentioned, and maybe you remember, Rasmus put a router outlet component in the app component, and that's the output of whatever gets loaded through the routing. There's a nice directive built in called router link that will, if you put this directive on a DOM element, it will actually trigger a routing to some route if you click on it. There are also two services that are very nice in the routing module. One of them is called Activated Route. That's a service that can provide you with information about what the route is right now through a paramap. So you can actually subscribe to this activated route and listen to route changes. And that can be the user typing in the URL, or of course loading a deep link or something like that that will trigger it. And also there's another nice service called Router that has a navigate method that will actually navigate you to a specific route. So if you put that together, I have an example here of a routes array. Like I said, it consists of route objects. Again, path, component are the two main ones. You see there's a data property. You can use that to pass in data. You can actually read through the activated route as well. And you have the option of rewriting. I think it's nice to actually focus on three things here. This path holds a specific syntax called :ID. That means that we actually want to know what comes after the hero and store that in a parameter called ID. So that actually makes it possible for us to read whatever is in URL. This path here says that if it's empty, and it's only empty, it's not just path of the math, part of the path that has to be empty, but it's all of it, then redirect to heroes, which is this one. And also, finally, you can actually make a path called double asterisk, which will actually mean anything not matched already will actually load the page not found component. And this route is in sequential order. It will try to match the first route. So obviously, if it matches Crisis Center, it will never match this one down here. And vice, it goes like this. I think that's, oh yeah, okay. One example here, just showing this router link directive. If you put it on, obviously it's supposed to go on an A tag, I guess, because that would be semantically correct, but I think you can put it on divs as well and other elements. You can actually link to this route, Crisis Center or Heroes that you actually see here. And this directive here is used to actually disabling this link. It's a quick way of doing an ngIf, I guess. And here it's the route outlet is shown. So if you click on one of these links in the navigation, it will load these components. Now it's back to you, Rasmus.
Yep. All right. So let's create some routes. So I'm in the app routing module, as Peter talked about, and let's create a route for the videos. So we'll do a path called videos / and then :query, which will tokenize this. So this will be a parameter we can use later on. And the component we want to actually load would be the video list component. That's also for good measure, create a catch-all route that catches everything that's not, doesn't look like this. And then we can redirect to the video / ambient. That will give us some search for that. So as you can see now over here, we actually have two video list components loaded now. And the reason for that is that in our app component, we have the app video list component, and we also have the router outlet. And now that we've set up a route, you can see the URL also changed here to videos/ambient because that's what we wanted to redirect to. And now that Angular picks up this videos route, it will actually inject the app video list right below this router outlet component. So we can get rid of this one because we want our router to control our component now. So let's just see. It still works as it should, but we want to do more. You can see that I search for dog, but the URL still says videos/ambient. So we want, in this little exercise, we want to change the URL when we search for something. And we also want to be able to load, if I refresh this URL, videos/ambient, I wanted to actually search for ambient on YouTube. So let's try and do that. So we can think of this as two different sources of search or keywords. Right now we have the field here, but we also have the URL. So which one should win? So I think what we'll do is actually make the URL here the authoritative source for keywords. So in order to do that, we need access to the router so we can actually navigate Angular's router, which we use to navigate, and I'll also inject the activated route. I'll just call that route. All right, so we have the user search here, and I'll also create a observable called URL search. And as you can see, and as Pierre said, it's all observables. So from the route, the activated route, I'll do param map, which you can see here is an observable of a param map. So that will emit every time the URL changes. So I want to pipe that and map, and I want to get our parameter, and we called that query. That's what we called it in the route here. So that's the token here. We named it query. So that's why I want to get this. So this URL search will contain searches from there. So instead of listening to user search here, let's try and see what happens if we listen to URL search instead. So now if we see that it searches for ambient, if I type dogs here, it will search for dogs. But I've broken the user search now because no one's listening to this. So we want to actually do something with this user search. We want to subscribe to that. And when that happens, we want to actually change the URL. So we do that by saying router.navigate. And that takes an array. And the first part is the first part of the path. And the second is the second path. So let's see. So if I type cats here, you can see the URL actually changed. So now if I do a search and I want to send it to my friend, I can just copy the link and send it to him. And when he reloads, he will also see the same search that I had. So with quite few lines of code, just combining some streams, we've actually made something fairly complex in a well, once you know it, readable way. I realize that if this is the first time you're seeing observable, it's probably confusing, but I hope you can appreciate the beauty of just combining streams of things. It's a very declarative way of doing it, and it's less error prone than having to keep a lot of local state where you keep track of, okay, this had that value and then a timer came and then I need to set that over here. This is just basically putting pipes together and turning on the data at some point.
They say there's nothing more beautiful than observables. That's what I heard. So
yeah. Yeah. So in the route, just a quick recap. We set up 2 routes. Well, one main route that loads the video list component whenever we hit a path that starts with videos/, and then we tokenize that so we get the query after that, and then we just have a catch-all route. And then we listen to that route by injecting the activated route and getting the query parameter from that. And we subscribe to our user search, and then whenever the user searches for something, we navigate to the route using that user search keyword. And then we are now using the URL as our one true source for search keywords instead of listening to user search. Yeah, if you've been listening really carefully, maybe you can see an issue here, because now we actually have a subscribe where we don't unsubscribe. So, and this user search is an infinite observable, as Pierre talked about, because I mean I can keep doing this forever. I can, but you get the point. So you don't know when that will end, and since you have a subscription to it, if I were to navigate to some other component in our app once it gets bigger, then we would actually have a memory leak, because we would still have an observable listening to coupled to this input field, and then it couldn't be garbage collected. So you would need to do to unsubscribe by doing that. Let me just show real quickly. You can actually when you call subscribe on an observable, it actually returns a subscription. So I don't know why. So subscribe returns a subscription, as you can see here, and then we can use our destroy lifecycle hook for a minute down here for convention's sake, and then we can call unsubscribe when the component is destroyed. So now we've cleaned up after ourselves. Yeah, so this is one way of doing it. There's another slightly nicer way of doing it, but it involves observables and it's a bit complicated. So I think I'll skip that for now. You can check it out in the code if you want to. Yeah, I don't know if we should in the last minutes have some questions and maybe just point people in the direction of the repo so they can show them where the code is. Would that make sense?
Yeah, maybe we could also skip to the directives real fast, but I don't know, depends on what people want. I think we should skip the animation step because that might not be as, it takes some time to go through and it might not be that interesting. I don't know.
Yeah. Okay, I'll just
and
show
it doesn't
real
seem there's any questions still in the chat, so go ahead, guys.
Okay, I'll just show you really quickly, just so you know, in the repo here, if you, we'll send you the link along with the slides.
Yeah, but you could type it in the chat as well, I guess, because doesn't that get saved?
Yeah, we can do that. Sure. Yeah, I'll do that later. But here we have, I mean, if you check out the master branch, it doesn't really have a lot. It just have some simple templates and styling. But if you, so you can work through what we've been doing by yourself. But if you get stuck or just want to see the code, we actually created 10 branches here, or 11 branches actually. So if you want to see what it looks like after we did the routing, you can just go to branch 5 routing, and then you can check that out and see. Okay, this is what it looks like in there.
Yes, you can see there's still some steps that we won't have time to go through that you can look at if you want.
Yeah, so directives, form validation, testing are the next steps. We might get to a sneak peek at directives, I guess. Yeah. Yes, but back to you, Per.
Yeah.
Last few minutes.
Yeah, so I guess we'll just look at directives because that's pretty quick and it's a very powerful feature of Angular, I guess. So for now, our sub goal is to create some functionality we can reuse on our DOM elements. And directives is just that. Those directives are custom behaviors that you can attach to components or DOM elements. You've already seen some directives. You've seen the ng4 that we've been using. Those are special kind of directives because they actually manipulate the DOM or the elements it's put on, because in ng4's example, it's actually fetching or taking it as a template, the whole element, and duplicating it. But there are different directives that are less, I guess, less complex, I guess, that can do simpler stuff, like maybe coloring the background and stuff like that. And I'll show you an example of that. So instead of the component attribute, we use the directive attribute, and it also takes a selector. But if you notice, the selector has the hard brackets around it. That's because these selectors of components and directives and pipes, well, actually not pipes, but components and directives at least, they comply to the CSS selector syntax. So, and a directive is just that. A directive is actually an attribute you put on an element. And attributes in CSS selection languages, well, shown with the heart brackets. But it kind of looks exactly like a component, which is also why a lot of people like to make directives, because you can attach those to components. Whereas a component, you'll make one component and you can't really combine two components in one. I mean, you can place them next to each other, but you can actually combine two directives in one, because you can put multiple directives on an element. So what you normally do is you actually inject an element ref into the constructor of your directive, which will give you a reference to the element that you place this directive on. And then you can do stuff. This is a really easy example of simple examples. The element ref has a property. I think it actually only has one property, which is the native element that it references. And that native element is a DOM element that has a style property, and that style property has, of course, a background color that you can set to something. So this is an example of using a directive called app highlight. You can see the selector is called app highlight. So this is just how you would define it. And this highlight me text would actually be highlighted with a yellow background. So like I briefly mentioned, a directive has a selector that you see up here, and it's used here. It uses constructor injection just like components, and it goes through exactly the same lifecycle hooks that component goes through. So you can hook up to destroy and init and all the change detection and view chill on hooks. I don't know if you want to show some code, or because we actually skipped the animation step, but I think that might not be so relevant.
No, let me see if I can code this in 1 minute. So I'm creating a directive called word count by using the Angular CLI again. It's the same basic idea. You use ngg, and then it's a directive this time, which created a word count directive for us. Yeah, so you can see it's annotated with directive. And as Pierre said, we want to inject something here. We want to get a hold of the element that we attach this directive to, and that's an element ref in Angular language, and it's a generic type, so we say that we expect it to be an HTML element. And then I want to use another lifecycle hook, which is after content init. So that happens a bit later than in on init. So we're actually able to get a hold of the actual content of the element. So I'll just grab a hold of the native element of this, which is the actual HTML element, and then I'll count the number of words in there. That's just a dumb little function, but let's try it. Words. So that would be. Then we'll split that, which will give us an array. So we split it by space, which gives an array, and we'll take the length of that array. Then we want to set the title of the element. That will give us a little, pop-up thing, and we'll set that to as. So now we actually have a directive that we can use wherever we want. So let's try and use it in here, for instance. So we'll use it on the description. So if I search for cats and hover over the description, we can see it now pops up this tooltip. This element has 30 words. And yeah. So this is a small reusable thing that actually augments the behavior of an element, and we can use it everywhere. We could doesn't have to be on some Angular component. We can use it on just a plain H1 on our header, for instance, and we can see that it will say this element has 2 words. So directives are incredibly powerful. You can use them for all kinds of stuff, and you can inject components and get access to the innards of the components that it's attached to and stuff like that. So you can build very powerful stuff. We've used it to, for instance, create a directive where you can just decorate a simple input field with a date picker directive, and then it will transform that input field into a date picker. But it will still work the same way as an input field, and it will respond to, or it will emit the same events, change events, and stuff like that. So it's a very powerful concept. for doing that. Yep. I guess we don't have time for.
I have one question, or actually, I think it's three questions, but I don't think we'll be able to answer those now. So I guess we'll send that out in the mail later.
Okay. Well. Okay.
Cool. I love your enthusiasm for Angular, but yes, we do need to start thinking about shutting down this event. Unless there's any last minute
Unless you have 2 more
questions.
hours, I guess.
Yeah. And yes, the link to the video will be distributed tomorrow as well, and it will also be accessible in the chat here. Great. So, Rasmus and Per, sorry about the negative comment. That doesn't normally happen. You shouldn't take that in. And of course, any constructive feedback is welcome, but please keep it respectful and professional. Tomorrow, as I said, you'll receive an email with a few links and slides and the video file. And if you have any feedback at all, you are very welcome to hit reply to that. We would appreciate that. So, Per and Rasmus, hopefully people got a taste of the possibilities offered by Angular. At least I did. So thank you so much for your time. And thank you everyone else for attending. We hope we'll see you all in real life soon, but a certain virus is blocking our path. So stay well and have a good evening, everyone.
Yeah, you too. Thank you.
Too.
It was fun.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It was.
Bye.
Yeah. Bye.